Hello, A pushers. Glad to be with you here. It's not going to be too long of a instruction today. Tomorrow, I would like you to join with me live. We're going to do a live session to really kind of get into what was going on with Watergate. So, if you know what Watergate was, great. You can add some things to the discussion, and if you don't, this will be a good one because it is an important part of our history to know in this period kind of what unfolded and really where you remember when we talked about the credibility gap, really where there began this true distrust of the government. It started with LBJ, and by the time we get to Nixon, we have a real skepticism and distrust of those who are in power, and Watergate was a big part of that. So, we've talked a lot about LBJ and the Great Society, and you did the LEQ for me. So we look at his Great Society programs as really kind of the New Deal, right? Like this is the New Deal 2.0, where he was putting lots of legislation and programs into practice that helped the poor, that helped those who were marginalized, especially the war on poverty, healthcare, education, all those things. So this was all coming about during LBJ's time. Engel versus Vital, this is what outlawed school prayer. It's why I teach in a Catholic school. I'm not saying that I disagree with LBJ's programs, but I see where this started to separate so much of society, for better and for worse sometimes. Okay, so we've talked about Medicare, we've talked about Medicaid. I just want to go on Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start. I think we talked about that. HUD, I know we talked about that. The Immigration and Nationality Act. This is the one, remember in 1921 and then again in 1924, when they put the quota system on, this has now been lifted. So we're talking about 64 or so. Do I have it down? 65. In 65, they abolished the quota system and it allowed immigrants to come in. Today, we have, boy, the last time I looked at the statistic, more than 10 million undocumented immigrants. And the thing is, they're human beings, right? Like we have to educate them, we have to feed them, we have to clothe them. And that takes a lot of collective effort by many different agencies, not just the federal government, but state government, by local governments. And sometimes there's some pushback because sometimes it feels like we're not doing enough for our own citizens. And so it's a big issue yet today. Griswold versus Connecticut. I don't think you even really need to know that too much. It said that married couples, like how would you approve that? But married couples could get contraception in the mail. Don't worry about that. The Warren Court. This is really what I want to talk about today. So the Warren Court is this time in the 60s. Supreme Court was a pretty liberal court. There was a lot of opposition by conservatives to the Warren Court, and there were quite a few pieces of legislation that went all the way up to the Warren Court, and they were really kind of expanding civil liberties, and they said that these were acceptable. It's known for its decision in the areas of civil liberty, civil rights. It revolutionized constitutional law in U.S. society. The number of civil liberties cases increased every year. During the 1968 Richard Nixon ran for president, criticizing the court as being soft on criminal procedure and moving too fast on civil liberties. So this is the one, the Miranda versus Arizona. If you have this one out, and I can go through this a little bit with you, I know that some of you were a little bit confused and you'd like to have a little bit of these blanks filled in. Well, let's at least do Miranda versus Arizona today. It's this one right here. So Miranda versus Arizona, this is in 1966, so that's the year. If you ever go to the site, it's OYEZ, it's oi. OYEZ is a good site to kind of help you explain or put in simple terms what the case was all about. So there was a guy named, I don't know his name. Do I have it written down? Ernesto Miranda. And he was basically coerced into giving an admission of guilt. Now, he did do the crime, but he was forced to giving to confess to a crime, which he did do. But he was kind of like forced to do it. He was kind of like intimidated into doing it. The case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Miranda actually wins. Ernesto Miranda wins. And so today we know it as the Miranda rights. If people are arrested, you have to be read your rights before like any proper proceeding can happen, lawful proceeding can happen. The first one is you have the right to remain silent. Now, you can give up that right. If you, what's the word? Waive that right. If you waive that right, that can be used you in a court, but you don't have to speak. You don't have to incriminate yourself. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford attorney, one will be provided to you. And do you understand these rights? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, actually, do you even speak English? So these were important. So Miranda won. The state of Arizona lost. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And now we have the Miranda rights. So in this box, that first one, the decision was that Miranda won. Miranda confessed to crimes he did commit without being informed of his Fifth Amendment rights. The right to an attorney, the right to silence. So the justification was that you do have a right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. You could waive those rights and speak, but then that could be used against you in court. So these are the Miranda rights. Griggs versus Duke Power. I mentioned this a little bit where it was unconstitutional for an employer to make you take a test in order to get a job in another part of that company. And so if you wanted to, say, advance into the company up the chain, you didn't have to take a test, where that's one way that they would keep people kind of from really progressing, especially minorities, from progressing in a job, is that they make them take a test. And again, it was kind of like a bogus test. And then Roe versus Wade. I think we're all familiar with Roe v. Wade. Her name was Jane Roe. She wanted to obtain an abortion. Actually, by the time it went to the Supreme Court, she had already had the baby. She was prevented from receiving an abortion. She didn't need a doctor's, before that you could obtain a doctor's, you could obtain an abortion with a doctor's note. She didn't want to do that. So due process allowed her to, well, not her, because she'd already actually had the baby, to obtain an abortion. So on this one, this is 1973. You can obtain an abortion without needing a doctor's order. This is due process that allows abortion, the 14th Amendment. And the justification for it was a woman's right to privacy that included the right to an abortion. Now, this has varied and each state gets to decide, but at that time, in the first trimester, which is about the first 3 months, the state could not intervene. It couldn't interfere. The second trimester, the state could if it was for the mother's health. And in the third trimester, the state could prohibit an abortion if the child was viable, actually. So these are some of the Warren Court decisions that, again, for better or worse, I think have really changed the course of history. And you can probably see, right? Do you have these rights, or is this taking away a right that is not actually yours to have? All right. So in the 1960s, conservatives challenged liberal laws and court decisions perceived moral and cultural decline, seeking to limit the role of the federal government and enact more assertive foreign policies. There was opposition to the Warren Court decisions. There was a lot of conservatives who said this is wrong. Like we are taking this and it was happening really quickly, from probably 1960 to 1970. Our Roe versus Wade was 73. There were a lot of changes happening really quickly. I think we're seeing it again right now in our own life. A lot of changes are happening really quickly. And there was a lot of pushback. Even today, we can see a lot of pushback. There was a liberal majority in the Warren Court. By time we get to 1964, now, so remember, LBJ becomes president when Kennedy is assassinated. LBJ is running on his own right in 64 on his own ticket, and he's running against a guy named Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater promised not to escalate the war in Vietnam. He said that he vows that, there would not be an escalation of the war. He's a very conservative Republican. He's from Arizona. I got to show you this video. Let's see if it can work. It just makes me laugh. It's a pretty funny one. Well, I hope. My internet has been really slow today. Well, here it is. Okay.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So, this poor child is just plucking, petals off the daisy, and that's actually known as the Daisy Campaign. And so this was, Vietnam is a big issue at this point, and we see what LBJ does. He escalates the war. Operation Rolling Thunder is the bombing campaign has happened, and now we're in a quagmire. We're in it, and we've got 500,000 troops at one time, sent over to Vietnam. Over 2 million over the course of the war. 58,000 men died, and sometimes we think like, for what? And by 68. LBJ knew he wasn't going to win. The Great Society is almost like an afterthought. As much greatness as he did with the legislation he brought forth, Vietnam is weighing too heavily on the minds of the people. And he famously says, I will not accept the nomination from my party for the presidency for another term. And so eventually we get to the election of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is a Republican. He's a Republican. He's more conservative. Richard Nixon had been big into government he had been Eisenhower's vice president. He kind of had a few things going on in his political life after Eisenhower is done being president. He goes back to California, kind of slinking away. We think that the political life for Richard Nixon is done until he makes his debut for the presidency in 1968. He wins. He defeats by a very, very narrow margin. Like President Johnson defeated Barry Goldwater by, I think, like maybe the largest landslide in all of American elections. It was huge. It was just huge. Richard Nixon defeats the other candidate, not Barry Goldwater, now I've lost his name, Hubert Humphrey, Minnesota, by a very slim margin. Actually, Hubert Humphrey had been Nixon's vice president, so he runs. And so then what's Nixon going to do with Vietnam? Nixon vows that he's not going to make the same mistakes that LBJ has with Vietnam, because he thinks that it's Vietnam that has lost LBJ a second election, which maybe rightly so he has. But then that's where we're going to get to as we talk about what happens with Watergate. Some groups on the left also rejected liberal policies, arguing that political leaders did too little to transform the racial and economic status quo at home and pursued immoral policies abroad. After the test I don't even have my numbers, but I know we're down to like 28 days or something like that, we're going to watch the movie Selma. And I know I've mentioned it before. And, you know, the MLK and leaders of the civil rights movement said, you're not doing enough. You're like giving lip service, but it's not actually enough. Like the Voting Rights Act was huge. Equal opportunity was a big deal, but it wasn't enough. The Black Panther Party we see coming out. Remember, we talked about the Black Panther Party before. They were pretty extremist. They were not the passive. They were quite aggressive. They didn't believe in nonviolence. They believed in violent revolution, unlike MLK. We see Yippies, the Black Power movement. The draft evasion. This is one I do want you to write down. So the draft evasion during Vietnam War was really very important. You can see a lot of famous names, a lot of well-known people who were able to get out of the draft during Vietnam. Most likely they evaded the draft by being in school. It was called a deferment. And so if you were in college, you could have a student deferment. Eventually, under Nixon, even those student deferments are going to end. But, you know, like Nixon is elected in 68. He takes office in early 69. So by 69, we're starting to draw down troops, but there's still quite a few. However, it's not like it was at the height of LBJ's time in 66 and 67 and 68. If you evaded the draft, you might have gone to Canada. You know, if you read the book, The Things They Carried, he struggled. You know, he was right there. Tim O'Brien says that actually never was a part of his life. That was a story, but I think that was quite common. George W. Bush, he evaded the draft. Bill Clinton evaded the draft. Dick Cheney evaded the draft. So it might have been legal. Some of them were illegal. And if you went to places like Canada to flee and get away from a draft, that was probably an illegal. Typically, you went to either Canada or Sweden, which is very interesting. Some people claim to be conscientious objectors, and conscientious objectors were another way of evading the draft. You would have said that you didn't want to join in the war for moral or religious reasons, that your religion prevented it. Muhammad Ali was actually... This is Muhammad Ali here. He was the famous boxer. He was drafted. He refused to go into the draft. He used conscientious objector status, but they didn't allow it because he was, do you remember Malcolm X? He had been part of the Nation of Islam, and so they rejected his conscientious objector status because he was part of the Nation of Islam. He actually went to jail for a very short amount of time, but it was really big news. So we see that this feeling at the time, if you were out of it, you know, and then eventually we're going to have a lottery, and I'll maybe show you how the lottery went based on your birth date. Anybody's birthday, September 14th, if your birthday was September 14th, the first year that they had the lottery, you're up, you're going. They had 195 birthdays the first year. We'll talk about the lottery maybe as we come together a little bit. But I hope you got the idea for those of you who read the things we carried, that this war was different. This was an entirely different type of war than anybody had ever experienced. This was not your dad's war. If you were a baby boomer, this was not your father's war. And so all of the civil rights, all of the issues, the policies abroad felt like it was all just happening at the same time, but not the way it needed to go. So there is a lot of issues with all of this. So we're going to stop right there, because tomorrow we're going to talk about Watergate right here. I'd like you, there's 2 documents. They're actually pretty short. They look long, but they're really big font. I'd like you to read the 2 documents on Watergate. One says Watergate background, and one says U.S. versus Nixon, or Nixon versus U.S. I want you to read those 2, because then tomorrow we're going to really talk about what Watergate was, how it all went down, and you're gonna write some things for me. I want to hear from you what you feel about it. So until we meet again, goodbye.